Hey, welcome to Scratching the Surface. I'm Jarrett Fuller, and this is my podcast about design criticism and practice. On this week's episode, I am joined by the designer, educator, writer, and researcher, Paul Bailey. Paul is currently the course leader for the MA Graphic Media Design program at the London College of Communication, an advisor at the Jan van Eyck Academie, and is a founding member of the Design Displacement Group. His current research interests include modes of writing in and around design and the forms of delivery and reception. In this conversation, Paul and I talk about how he began his expanded practice that ranges from exhibitions, publications, performances, workshops, and writing, as well as his work at the London College of Communication and how he thinks about teaching and how the roles of design research and writing influence that program. I think Paul has a really interesting and unique practice, and I was especially curious to hear about how it's evolved and how it influences his work in the classroom. This was a really fascinating conversation. If you're a fan of the podcast and want to help support it, you can become a member for $5 a month or $50 a year. Members get an exclusive monthly newsletter that I think of as the sort of director's commentary for the podcast. Each month I share additional content, episode previews, and short essays related to the themes of the podcast. These memberships really help keep Scratching the Surface going, and I just really appreciate all of your support and hope that you enjoy this conversation with Paul Bailey. I think it'd be really helpful to just start with a little bit of your background and how you got interested in design, or where design came into your life, and kind of how you got started on this career that you've had.
I'm Irish. I grew up in Ireland, in the middle of Ireland, a place called Roscommon, to farming parents with brothers and sisters who are really involved with different types of trades. So some carpenters, some builders, mechanics, electricians, nice. Interior architects. So I suppose it's, I've been arguing, well, I can go back to that a little bit later on, but I think it's something that in our family that we're kind of always quite practical, hands-on, and engaged with kind of being producers in our working lives. But I began my studies at the Limerick School of Art and Design.
Okay.
In communication, visual communication it was called. I did a BA there, and I found myself there just through a series of interesting, I suppose, coincidences or happenings where whilst I was studying in school for my leaving cert in Roscommon, we were asked to do this exam where it was kind of one of these exams that tested your aptitude for different things.
Oh, yeah.
And then shortly afterwards, you were invited to a meeting with the career counsellor, guidance counsellor. Mm-hmm. And yeah, she reviewed my aptitudes at that time, and she asked me if I've ever heard about this thing called graphic design. And I was like, no, absolutely not. What might that be, and what could that be? And she told me a little bit about it, and I didn't really think much about it at that time. I was like, that's kind of interesting. And then following my leaving cert, which is our final major exam when you finish secondary school, so maybe your high school.
Okay, yeah.
It's exams you do before you move on to university. I decided that I would go to art college with a group of friends who actually headed in that direction too. And then I found myself in Limerick, and in the way that art college is organised, or was organised, was that it would run for 4 years, and in your first year you would encounter many different disciplines and practices.
Right.
And it was through that then that I began to hear about graphic design again. Mm-hmm. And then, there's a visual communications department, and I chose to specialise in that field.
So you actually went to college not thinking about graphic design necessarily, even though you had taken that test and the counselor said, hey, this is something you might be good at. You kind of went more just general art and visual things.
Yeah, before I went to art college, I spent some time in Galway, Galway City, the west coast of Ireland, developing a portfolio in a small place called GMIT. And It did come up there again, actually. There was discussions about graphic design, and I was like, that's interesting. But I also was surrounded by an amazing bunch of painters and sculptors and people making performances, and I was equally intrigued in those practices as much as I was thinking about what it might mean to be a graphic designer. So that's when I did arrive in Limerick. I welcomed this 1 year of exploration and through different expertise and disciplines and tools and ideas. But I had then decided, I was kind of toying. I was doing visual communication exercises in the sculpture department as many of my friends were there. And I think that's had quite a formative effect on the way that I've been thinking about what could be determined and expanded definition of what graphic design might be.
That sets up so much of what I want to talk about, and I want to go into that a little bit more, but I have one other question just to kind of tie this up before we talk about that. Can you talk about, or do you have any sense even of what it was about graphic design when you were that age that really grabbed you? Even though you were doing paintings and sculptures and all of this other stuff, and that you took this test that recommended graphic design, what was it about graphic design that kind of connected with you, do you think?
I think the thing that coaxed me to explore it throughout my degree was a concern for language and like the written word and the way the written word formulates its meaning through the way it's composed, much in the way that it's wrote, but also in the way that we might typeset, or we might then produce it through different media and means and forms. And even then, I was quite interested in thinking about where the designer's contribution to the understanding of that text concludes or begins. And I was often thinking about when we produce these things, how are they distributed and made public, even very, very early on. And I think I saw maybe as a graphic designer, I would have an opportunity to step into that discussion in many moments.
Yeah.
Much more than I could at that time imagine. I was so excited about sculpture, but I suppose I didn't have such a clear read of what it was. Whereas I think graphic design as a practice is
that's
much
interesting.
More, for me at that time anyway. For me, it was much more legible, and there was also a great department that was really. It was easy to kind of feel myself there. There was a really strong team. I'd seen amazing graduates come through there. So I think I was kind of fortunate I knew it would be an exciting space to be, and I knew I'd have the space to kind of test and expand and explore.
I mean, you mentioned, you had mentioned earlier about how that kind of early education has shaped what you think graphic design is, or what graphic design could be, and kind of, maybe pushing those boundaries a little bit, or kind of questioning what we traditionally think of as graphic design. And that's something that I'm very interested in. That's something that comes up on the podcast all the time. In a lot of ways, I think that's why I went back to graduate school, was because I started to kind of feel like what I was taught graphic design wasn't sufficient for what I wanted to do anymore. And I wanted to see if that term still worked for what I called myself and the work that I wanted to do. Could you talk, I don't know if I have a question in other than I would love for you to talk more about that, but maybe connecting that to your early education. How was graphic design presented to you, and how did you start to think about the other forms or the other mediums or the other kind of ways of practice?
I think the model of teaching at the Limerick School of Art and Design was essentially that we had a studio, and all 3 years would be in the studio, with the final year having a desk space that they could really sit and reside within. We were introduced, typography was a very big concern for the department. So we spent quite a bit of time exploring the kind of technicalities and the histories and the canon of typography. But then we're also opened up, a lot of space to kind of, think about what it isn't and what haven't we seen, and where do our identities contribute to that, or how could they? And yeah, I think I suppose having this kind of open like studio model, that was kind of common across the departments. So whilst I would have a desk space in a visual communication department, like I said, I would often go and spend a lot of time upstairs with the painters, or spend a lot of time in the sculpture studio. So when we were given briefs, I think I was always quite interested in, well, not that concerned about the fact that this needs to look like graphic design.
Yeah.
I was always kind of informed by a way of thinking graphically, and by that I mean, they were very interested at that time in thinking about how do you problem solve, how do you kind of conceptualize, how do you, like the traditional things that we would see in most graphic design terms. But I don't know, maybe I was just very influenced by the communities that I was socializing within as much as the communities who were my peer group within my subject. And yeah, and so how has that been formative?
Let me phrase it a different way, or try to be a little more specific, because as you're talking, I'm just thinking about your career and the work you've done, and that you have done work that, I don't mean for this to sound so like I'm putting borders around things, but you've done things that would be considered traditional graphic design, but you're also teaching. You've done kind of writing projects. You've done kind of more curatorial projects, kind of performance-based things. All of these things that maybe we don't consider graphic design, but they all seem to come from the same place for you. It doesn't seem like you're jumping around. It seems like a really coherent body of work. And I'm kind of wondering maybe how you think about that, and how that, hanging with the painters, hanging with the sculptures, kind of studying typography, how did all those things kind of come together that you could build this type of career? Yeah.
I think it's been quite an intuitive approach.
Okay.
I think I've had an interest, and a concern, I've followed that, and I suppose been lucky to, again, surround myself with communities who are kind of interested in exploring the practices and sharing them, and looking at ideas of exchange through practice. But I would say, I moved from Ireland. I moved up to London, where I'm based now, to complete my MA at Central St. Martin's. And then I had a number of years, about 5 years after that, where I'd begun teaching, and I was become really interested in the design of pedagogy, design education. And it was involved in really interesting programs. But then I did take a moment to say, look, I'm kind of taking on these commissions. I'm exploring these ideas of design pedagogy. I'm starting to conduct or extend some of my own independent research. It would be helpful to stick with this for a minute. I applied to conduct a residency at the Jan van Eyck Academie in the Netherlands.
Okay, yeah.
And that was the first time I really ever had a studio. And it was also, again, within a fascinating group of people. And it was there I began to understand that, whilst my outputs may vary, like across media or publics, or draw upon different types of content and have different concerns, the thing that would drive them, or maybe I've seen as a bit of a thread, is there's a kind of a deep concern for the forms of research that are undertaken. And then also, more following that, I think a concern for how we could model a critical practice through design. And I think they're kind of the two, that kind of, I suppose they're the things that are consistent. Like and even, within the MA program I direct here at LCC, it's really looking at that. It's like, how can we reposition graphic design as a critical tool to deal with the peculiarities or the current conditions of contemporary culture. I think it all kind of sits in that, with that pocket. But I think it definitely, it walks around that somehow.
Yeah. I mean, and I love that, and I feel like you've set up everything that I kind of have want to talk to you about. So let's start with teaching a little bit, and kind of design of pedagogy. Where did that come from? How did you kind of land in that space, or realize that was something you're interested in?
So actually, throughout my education, I was asking lots of questions to the way the courses were structured and the institutions were organized. And I suppose I was always asking what if and what else. And then after I completed my MA, I spent some time away from London. I used to dance, and I was away on tour, and I came back and I realized I needed some money to stay in London if I could continue. And just a really nice thing happened one afternoon with a group of friends who also had finished their studies. We're trying to find ways to sustain our practices in London at that time. And we basically gathered a series of jobs that were available and we pooled them. And one of the jobs was for a teaching job at a university in Southend in the UK. And it was just given that I would apply for that, and it was a very natural choice. So I began there, I got that job, and on my first day of that job, I was informed I'd become the course director because I'd left. So I was like 25 or 26 on my first day teaching, and I was informed I was the course director. So I had two choices. I had to say, well, one, I walk out the door and just like figure out something else to do, or two, actually, maybe this is a great opportunity to kind of be very upfront and honest with the students I would work with about a deep interest in the way we organise our forms of education. And so I stayed there for 2 years, and I worked with an amazing bunch of people. And then I became aware of a course at the London College of Communication, which was called Design for Graphic Communication. It's become something else now. With an amazing team, and a guy called Darren Raven, who is the director, who has done incredible work in exploring and advancing how we can, very simply, how we can work with students or participants to inform them about how they're learning as much as what they're learning. So when I joined that team, I was so impressed to see Darren and the existing team talking in the studio to graphic design students about, forms of pedagogy that the sessions were designed from and around and why. Yeah, just became very natural. And so I think I was I talk about being lucky, and it seems quite a lot because I feel very fortunate to have met people like that and to see the impact of empowering students to understand that they actually have the agency to identify their own forms of learning, and that they can draw from different philosophies, and that there's not one kind of fixed, determined right right role, I suppose. So it's really sitting within that. It just becomes I can't imagine not being concerned with that. After I think you're exposed to it, I think you see and you feel a responsibility for, when you're making these decisions about designing educational programs, you've got this. It's an amazing honor and it's an amazing responsibility. But it's a very exciting, experimental, and it's space, I guess. So there's a collection of these things.
Yeah, I mean, it's so interesting to hear you say that because as teaching has become a bigger and bigger part of my practice and is now really the direction that I see my career going. I've been adjunct now for 3.5 years, almost 4 years, and am now at a point where it's like, I think this is actually the thing that I kind of want to build everything else around, and thinking about kind of full-time teaching appointments and that sort of thing. But over the last couple months, I've been thinking about the evolution of my teaching approach and how I bring myself to the classroom. And I realized how, kind of like you, started teaching fairly young, but felt like I had to have all the answers, that I had to be able to kind of tell the students, here's how you do it. And each year there's less and less of that. And it's more of letting the students lead and find their own way, exactly like what you were just talking about. And then also bringing my own interests into the classroom. I've talked about this on the podcast before. I came up at a design system where it was very kind of modernist based. Here's how you set up grids. Here's how you do this. This is what good graphic design is. And so I was kind of very self-conscious of bringing my own research and opinions into the classroom as a teacher. And I found the more I can connect here's the stuff that I'm working through in my own practice, bringing that to the classroom, it just makes everything much more dynamic. It makes the students much more interested. They start bringing in their interests. And I feel like acknowledging to the students that I am learning in this process also has completely changed the way I think about my role as a teacher. And so, again, I don't know if there's a question there other than hearing you say that is kind of like helping me reflect on something I've been thinking about for the last couple of months about my role. And it seems like that was something that was very natural for you right away. And maybe that was starting young, that you're like, we're just kind of all in this together.
Yeah, I think it's really important to be kind of open about the kind of remit or the scope or the ambitions you have for something. And I think for me, if we're talking about like an academic situation, I think it's productive to set that out clearly that can then become the parameters for people to step into or step out of or fight against or fight for these conditions. And I think like I've been heavily influenced by many of the people that have worked around me, but also on the MA Graphic Media Design course. So for us, we approach the people who choose to do this course as participants as opposed to this idea of the student and the tutor. We observe that we kind of reside alongside or work alongside the participants' research and concerns, and we operate as a kind of a critical framework through a critical studio practice to help them advance that in whatever ways that they identify and kind of argue and can support through kind of clear, informed, progressive research practices.
Yeah, I love that. How has being a teacher, how has being in the classroom now as part of your practice, how has that changed how you think about graphic design or think about your own practice?
I think what it does, which is fantastic and exhausting at the same time, is that particularly at a postgraduate level, although I guess across all levels, I think anybody engaged in design education or any form of pedagogy who's a deep interest in the subject has to always ask themselves, how can we draw that line between a kind of a very young and unstable and sometimes not quite legible history to something that's emergent and shifting and more. And I think that's incredibly exciting, and I think I'm really proud to have worked with many of the graduates from this young program, this MA Graphic Media Design program, that have really came to approach their postgraduate studies for their independent research, but really also thinking about how that contributes to a kind of further canon of the practice of design.
That's great.
And I think, so I think to answer your question, I think how has it informed me? I think it's left me kind of relentlessly inquisitive and curious about what might emerge next, but also conscious that how can we think about that kind of trajectory by like drawing a lineage from what's come before or around it. I think, and I sort of find myself, that's the text, and I find that complex, and I don't assume that I have direct and clear answers to that, but that's what keeps me pivoting. I think each time I'm like, oh yeah, that makes a bit of sense, and like, but what about this, and how can we now begin to approach that? So like a nice example maybe to mention is something we've just launched this term with the MA Graphic Media Design Group. It's a workshop series which we call the Reciprocal Studio. It's a nice example maybe to talk about this idea of how we can independently and collaboratively cultivate knowledge through the practices and procedures of graphic design and research. So that takes shape as where we invite 4 guests to run 4 distinct research studios, and they depart from a particular theme. So last year we explored ideas of media redistribution and leakage.
Nice.
And this year we're looking at the conditions of distraction.
Oh, I love that. So
there's there's 4 amazing guests working with us right now. 2 just launched this week and 2 are going to launch next week. There's Martha Prinz and Benedict WhatsApp, who formulate a duo called Confusion of Tongues. They're based in Amsterdam and Berlin.
That sounds really familiar.
And they're doing a project that is looking at the Frontex archive. So the Frontex are this border control agency,
Okay.
who also happen to have a photographic exhibition for their staff that becomes this competition that is presented at a trade fair. So they're working with the participants to examine the rhetorics that emerge, and when an image that's produced by the technologies of border control by an agency, a company like Frontex, then shift over to this kind of cultural and expressive field of like the photographic image in an exhibition context. So we're working towards staging and curating a show here on Tuesday, exploring some of these conditions.
Oh, wow.
And yesterday we were really lucky to have Susan Shupley from the from the Centre for Architectural Research at Goldsmiths, her practice on image reading. And so I think that's something that's just fantastic, that you're here, you have the opportunity to invite fantastic practitioners to talk about their methodologies, their concerns, their interests, but through the practices. It's actually through practice with these researchers and guests.
Can you talk more? And I think that actually really nicely connects back to what you were saying earlier about your focus on kind of reimagining graphic design. I'm going to get your words wrong a little bit, but something about reimagining graphic design as a critical practice or kind of the role of research that you were kind of talking about before.
Yeah.
Can you talk more about what that means and how you think about that?
So the MA Graphic Media Design course is a development from a previous postgraduate course here at LCC, a really successful course run by Russell Besley called MA Graphic Design.
Okay.
We were invited by the dean at that about 4 years ago, Lawrence Egan, to think about the next stages for this postgraduate program and what the new concerns of this MA might be. And after conducting various forms of research with my colleagues Tony Credland and Vanessa Price, we could see an opportunity for a master's program that really set out to position graphic design as a critical tool to examine the kind of requirements and peculiarities and concerns of a contemporary culture through a research practice. So what that's meant for us is to ask questions as to what is design research, what does a critical practice to design look like. We ask ourselves questions about the role of writing at postgraduate level in a subject of like graphic design. We asked each other lots of questions, and many other people, and it's quite an undertaking. And I think with that we said, let's just get this thing off the ground, and we got the support of the school to do so. So across the years, we're working with our third group of participants. What's been exciting is to see, the researchers coming through who have, I suppose, particular questions to their practice, their existing practices. If they come as graphic designers, we've got people who joined us from various different fields, like a professor of law.
Oh, nice.
Yeah, this amazing lady, Amanda, who was concerned that law kind of typically exists as a text-based discipline, and what about the role of the image in that field?
Oh, that's amazing.
And so, I suppose, and she's done very interesting things as a professor of law. Actually, she's gone on to take on some of the methods that she was introduced to in the MA program to now teach her students who are doing PhDs in law.
I love that.
It's kind of remarkable and bizarre, and I think it needs some working out, but it's a very exciting development, which we would have never anticipated. But I think, more broadly, what's exciting for us is to see, maybe with the way that things have been developing, that there's been much more sensitive read and effect of economic and political and social issues across here in the UK, but also internationally, and to see those things show themselves within the critical studio practice is very challenging and confronting. And I suppose what we're trying to do is to figure out strategies to design research and how you might begin to address some aspects of that in a way that kind of makes sense to your position as a practitioner and also speaks into the requirements of research, but then also does understand how it sits within design practice more broadly.
I hope this is not a too specific question, but can you talk about how you work with your students to hit that intersection of being good research, but also being a part of the graphic design discourse? That kind of intersection there, I find really fascinating. Can you talk more about that?
Yeah, I suppose it's hard to say this exactly when it all happens because
Right, yeah.
it happens different times for different people, and actually we're seeing it often happens after graduation, too, in many cases. But I think to look at it in a really simplified and pared back way, things that we'll always just ask the participants to examine are their intentions that might show themselves in a research question or a statement or a particular articulation of that intention. Thinking about the method by what the impact of that method on the way that they might begin to examine those or explore those intentions, what insights they might then begin to establish and how they can make that visible and relatable to others. And then we really spend a lot of time talking about the socialization of the research and as it's been developed, and then also when they find it's come to a point to make public.
Yeah.
I think within those questions, you can't avoid this idea of identifying your critical position within the subject and in reference to the subject, your identity as a design researcher, and then also your contribution to the practices of that graphic design. I think if you really unpack and really ask yourself how you speaking to or against those questions, you are triangulating those things that you're finding that space.
This is a very probably selfish question because this is something I think about a lot with my own students, and this is more with undergrad students. So I'm not sure if this is kind of directly related to what we're talking about, but I find a tension with certain students who are really interested in bringing their own point of view, their own research into their work, but then there's always a group of students who are very conscious about making work that is quote unquote portfolio ready, that will get them jobs. I always have a group of students that just, what will get me a job? And I always struggle with the balance of knowing that is a very real financial concern, but also this is a time for you to do this research, and honestly, you probably won't have this again. So let's worry about jobs later, but also knowing that that's somewhat irresponsible. Do you have that issue, or do you have advice for that type of student?
I do. I think the confronting conversations we've had as a team and with the participants amongst themselves also, and with guests, is the fact that a critical practice in and through graphic design isn't that visible, and it doesn't often show itself as an economically viable practice.
Right.
So one of the things that we discuss is that one aspect of your practice is that what you make in response to your research findings, your interpretation, your contribution to this field of knowledge or discussion, whatever, this conversation. But the other thing that's, I think, where you can see real profit and transferability is when you undertake a master's program. Our master's program at least, we're asking the participants to consider how they designed a design research project. And within that, it calls into question that you are then required to understand these ideas of intention, method, insight. And I think if you can demonstrate that capacity, you also then have the opportunity to kind of lead others to a similar process. So that kind of brings you
Right.
towards opportunities to kind of initiate, to take ownership, to anticipate, to bring others into, guide them through a complex um, undertaking, which is kind of very, very personal in many ways, but it also then it moves from the personal to the disciplinary to the public. So I don't know. I think through that conversation, it does kind of subside those concerns or fears that leaves them unemployable, because it might be, when we say critical, people often then move
Right.
towards, so, or they move towards it doesn't look like graphic design, or it doesn't, but actually I'd argue that it's in the design of the design research itself that you're going to probably find your next opportunity, as much as what it is that you make in response to your research.
Right. Yeah. That makes a lot of sense. And like I said, I that it was a purely selfish question, because my gut, my initial reaction when a student asks me about finding a job is like, don't worry about it. Graphic design can be more than what we always think of as graphic design. But I also think to just discount those questions about jobs and careers is a little bit disingenuous and maybe a disservice. And I've been struggling of how to sympathize and with that desire, with saying, but graphic design can be all this other really interesting stuff. I think
Yeah,
that's a good way to
yeah,
kind of think about it.
yeah. No, I think as well. Like an example, like we've been introduced to two graduates from the MA program, Casey Evans and Gabriella, and what's interesting with those two in particular is they came to the course as both graphic
Right.
designers who are working in their field, who are interested in exploring a critical practice through design. And as they've graduated from the MA, they've edited and been part of the launch of a critical reader of design research, a language forms volume
Right.
that they edited, published, and designed with a team. So then they've built these skills as editors, and following that, they've also, or alongside that, they were writing up reviews of events we've had
Right.
here at
Yeah.
LCC, where they write for the Design Observer. They've now been commissioned for iMagazine, so they know how to author their research. They know how to kind of take those skills and make them into other kind of use them in other spaces. And I think we're seeing that more and more. I think
Yeah.
we see
Yeah.
graduates from this program anyway, basically by examining their kind of what kind of skills they've been asked to kind of exercise, they can see that they can apply them then in other fields. So a practice becomes much more comprehensive and expansive.
How do you encourage students to kind of find their own interests and their own practices while also kind of bringing in your own interests and your own practice into the classroom, to not let students to not show students, this is the, I want you to be like me, I want you to have a career like me? How do you kind of encourage students to find their place in that, or how do you create a framework that allows students to kind of thrive in figuring out what their practice is, which in my experience a lot of grad school is I have this sense that there's this other way to work. I have these interests. I don't know how to bring them together. How do you kind of set up a place where students can do that?
Yeah, no, I think this is really important. And I think it comes down to this idea of feeling a responsibility when you're developing a program, that you're not, for me personally, I don't
Yep.
think I'm in a position and to kind of say, this is the track, this is
Right.
a direction. So strategies that we've developed is by developing a team that is representative of a range of practices, but at its core demonstrates a clear concern for critical practice through design. So, for example, there's Sophie DeMay, who works on the course, who has a practice where she runs an independent studio. She's a design writer. She writes for a Tap magazine. She's a curator,
Okay.
and she's got a big interest in the design of design education. So Sophie also she's from France, so she's here studying through a second language. So female
Nice.
designer in the studio. There's lots of amazing things that Sophie brings with her. Alongside her, there's Charlotte Maeva Perret, who's also coming from France, but is got a really strong, exciting research-driven practice, which shows her exploring, again, writing, filmmaking, installation, commissions, asking really great questions that the concerns of branding and identity and representation, and broader, like, kind of socio-political issues. There's then Bryn Brannigan, who has a really exciting practice where he's looking at material narratives through conditions of place in London and more broadly. We've got Tony Credland, who's got an incredible background in editorial and publishing, but is really deeply concerned with design activism and is involved with many fascinating initiatives. There's Bryony Quinn, who's a background in she's fantastic, and she's come into the course and been really formative in thinking about how we might approach writing, design writing as a critical visual practice. Tamar Shafir, who comes over from the Netherlands, she runs an amazing series. So it's about building a team that models these ideas of varieties of practices, but
that's interesting.
The responsibilities of people taking responsibility to what they do and looking at ways of advancing their contributions. I like then looking at stuff that we do within the course. I think asking the participants to develop aligned which forms of volume has been really, really a huge transitional moment for all of them, because it's we set it out to ask the question is, how do we make design research public?
Right.
You're here for just over a year. We make it public through a public exhibition here at the college, but what about, we talk about exploring writing as a critical visual practice. What about publishing that? So
right.
They've had to examine with some advising, so some advising from Bryony Quinn, some from Wayne Daly and Claire Lyon from Daily Leon, for the first time, how they might begin to approach that. And they are the authors of this project where they look at strategies for making it public. And that draws a bit upon Matthew Stadler's thinking around that move from public to publication.
Right.
And he became a kind of key influence on the second volume, which we launched in December. I think these things that sit alongside or even outside of the core curriculum, let's say, establish a kind of a reality. And they do something really quite effective where they kind of push past that institutional frame, and they kind of diminish these ideas of like the established designer who's kind of just got it all set up and knows what they're doing, or the writer or the theorist or the philosopher, whoever, but that these are people always kind of trying to develop their own practices as well. And like, where do you sit alongside that? So that's just one example. Like, the course is, like I mentioned, is very interested in how we can socialize research and progress as much as research and completion, or when it's ready to be packaged and digestible. It's interesting when it's messy and complete as well. And that's often where I think it's important to have people to step in and give it some frame.
Yeah. I mean, speaking of research and kind of independent practice, what are the things that are on your mind right now, or what are the things you're thinking about and spending time kind of reading and researching?
Well, when I went over to conduct the residency at the Jan van Eyck Academie about 3 or 4 years ago, I went there to explore a proposed shift in hierarchy between the practices and conditions of reading and watching, against the backdrop of kind of new information environments. So what does it mean for us to kind of read across platforms and spaces? And just through like an explorative and experimental studio practice, I came to get to unpack that in various ways, through kind of website-specific installations, through writings and performances. But what's been very interesting is to see that then translate into like applied commissions. So I feel like even though that was conducting that research in a very open, explorative way in the studio with the great support of the Van Eyck, as I've been approached for commissions in the years since, it kind of speaks into that research that I conducted then. So, for example, a commission I'm working on right now is a project with the Victorian Albert Museum. I've been commissioned by Natalie Kane, the curator of digital design, to design the exhibition and a publication for the forensic architecture.
Oh, nice.
At the Milan Design Triennial.
Yeah.
So it's the UK Pavilion, and it's presenting a case from forensic architecture that was presented here in London for the London Design Biennial a few months ago.
Oh, that's great.
So it's a very interesting commission because it calls into question these behaviours of reading and watching, of course. And the case in particular is looking at a case of genocide for the Yazidi people in northern Iraq, and how building the case is basically identified this as a case of genocide and is going to be picked up by the UN and carried forward. But how do you approach exhibiting a forensic case? What does that do in a triennial where it's the UK Pavilion alongside many other countries? So it's brought me towards looking at going back into some of my research, looking at stuff that the independent group were doing at the ICA with the parallels of life. We've been looking at Herbert Bayer's work with the mobile IP. We've been looking at what is the material narrative that we could use to talk about the methodologies that forensic architecture use, which is essentially an exercise in composites and stitching. Are there materials that can speak to that? So, it's a long way of answering your question, maybe, but I find the research I've undertaken, which looks maybe not like design for some time, maybe is adopting a vernacular of installation and assemblage.
Yeah.
And really practically is coming back to inform these projects that are kind of fascinating commissions, but incredibly complex. And I feel fortunate I had that time to really unpack some of these questions.
Yeah, it's actually really interesting that, things you were researching and thinking about years ago are now manifesting themselves in work for other people. I think that actually kind of connects to a lot of the things we've been talking about through this conversation. My last question, and this is a question that I use to end all of these interviews, is I'm really curious, who are the writers or the designers or the books that have really influenced how you think about all of this that we've talked about today? People that you kind of find yourself returning to again and again, or who have had a big impact on your thinking?
There's a lot. Where would I start? I think one book I read, it's about a year ago, I think last summer, is Essayism from Brian Dillon.
Oh, that's been on my list.
Really interested in. It's fantastic. It's a great book where it's like his biography, but it's his biography through his experiences of encountering the essay, and also writing it as an essay. And he draws together an amazing body of reference. But I'm very interested, along with my colleague Sophie, who I mentioned, we're very interested in how we could explore what is the role of the visual essay? What is the opportunity of the visual essay as a site of critical inquiry in and through graphic design?
Yeah.
And so, the idea of like his writings on the essay are going to inform a series that we'll do again. So I returned to that quite a bit. I also love that book I read around similar time, Confabulations from John Berger. Really eclectic book. In terms of like practices that also like bricks from the kiln, I think I've been a contributor. I know Matthew. Matthew is also an advisor for Alignment Forms of Volume 2. I think that's doing a really interesting job of bringing us towards questions of what it is to explore the text and image and sound together, but in a very nuanced and sensitive and very generous exercise. I think it's a very exciting project. Other things, I don't know, I'd have to say I'm very excited about having this opportunity to bring people like Confusion of Tongues that I've just mentioned, or there's a practice, a duo called the Demystification Committee.
It sounds familiar.
They're doing a lot of work looking at the design of offshore banking.
Okay.
But modeling it and setting up a practice that is existing within that site, and they're running one of the projects at the minute also. And there's Fraud, who are like a critical duo. like artists that are kind of residents at Somerset House, but they're doing an incredible research project called Eurovision, which is examining the impact of technologies on border control.
Oh, nice.
And then Francisco Laranjo is joining us as well.
Oh, nice.
From Modes of Criticism.
Yeah.
And I think that's a bit, I think there's been a contribution to what is a critical practice in graphic design. I think he's done great with his PhD, and I think the work he's continuing with like the Shared Institute is also very exciting. There's loads. I've also enjoyed working with the Design Displacement Group.
Oh, yeah. We didn't even have time to talk about them. Yeah.
Like there's lots. I could listen. I could maybe through some more.
I think that's a great. I thought that was a great list. It's a good. I always love when people answer that question with a mix of things that I'm familiar with, and then people that I know nothing about, and you kind of covered both of those. This was so fun for me. Thanks for being on the podcast.
No, thank you very much. It's been very nice to have a chat.
This episode was recorded on January 11th, 2019. Our theme music is by Andy Borgasani. We're on Twitter and Instagram at Surface Podcast. You can find us wherever you get your podcasts and at scratchingthesurface.fm. Thanks for listening.